Welcome back to another deep dive. This time, we're headed straight to the Faroe Islands. For a quick roundup of all the news from today, we'll be covering everything from politics to business, sports, and even some cultural tidbits, all pulled from today's Faroe's news sources. So, are you ready to get up to speed?
Absolutely. Let's jump right into it, starting with politics. There's been a shakeup at Kringvarp Faroe. The director was dismissed due to an illegal exemption of the broadcasting fee.
Wow, that's big news. So who's filling in while they find a permanent replacement?
Katrin Peterson will be serving as interim director while they sort things out. But that's not the only political news making waves today. There's a heated debate going on about proposed changes to the subsistence allowance.
Ah, yes, the support system for families facing financial difficulties.
Right. Opposition members on the Welfare Committee are arguing that removing this support would be a huge blow to struggling families.
I can see why that would be a concern. It's a sensitive issue with potentially far-reaching consequences. Looks like we have another political development to unpack.
Yeah, Christina Samuelson is launching an investigation into a complaint filed by Arnie Skyle against Dennis Holm. The complaint revolves around the allocation of blue whiting, a type of fish, for those who aren't familiar.
Oh, interesting. So, moving away from the political arena, what's
Right.
happening in the world of Faroe's business?
Well, there's been a major acquisition. FK, a prominent Faroes company, is being acquired by a Danish company,
That's significant.
and the competition authority has already given the deal the green light, so it seems they don't foresee any major issues arising from it.
All right, so what else is going on in the business world?
There are some interesting trends emerging in the car market. Data shows that there were 433 fewer vehicles registered this year compared to last.
Wow, that's a pretty sharp decline.
It is, and if you look specifically at new car registrations, from January to November of this year, they've decreased by almost 23%.
That's quite a drop. It makes you wonder what factors are contributing to that shift. Okay, let's shift gears ourselves and head over to the world of sports. What have our Faroes athletes been up to?
The Faroe swimmers put on quite a show at a recent Nordic competition. They really made a splash with some impressive performances.
That's fantastic to hear. Always love to see Faroes athletes shine on the international stage. And speaking of international competition, the Faroe Islands women's handball team went head-to-head against Denmark in a European Championship match.
They did, and at the same time, the Faroe Islands women's U19 football team was competing in the European Championship qualifiers in Serbia.
Wow, it sounds like Faroes athletes are making their mark across a variety of sports.
Indeed, they're certainly a force to be reckoned with.
It's inspiring to see them competing at such a high level.
Okay, before we move on, any news from the weather front?
It seems like it's been a pretty uneventful day, weather-wise. No major storms or unusual weather patterns to report.
Well, that's good news. No need to batten down the hatches today. But there's one other news item that caught my eye.
You thinking about the drone incident near the airport?
Exactly. A bit concerning, isn't it? Definitely something that warrants investigation. The police are currently looking into it.
Good to know they're on the case. And to wrap things up, we have a bit of news from the world of literature.
Oh, yes. Two young women have just released their first children's books, adding to the rich storytelling tradition of the Faroe Islands.
It's fantastic to see that creative spirit alive and well.
Absolutely. It really highlights the diverse range of news coming out of the Faroe Islands today.
It's true. From political shakeups to business acquisitions, sporting achievements, and even literary contributions, it's a fascinating snapshot of life in the islands.
It really is.
It's amazing how these seemingly separate stories, when woven together, create a more complete picture of what's happening in the Faroe Islands.
You've hit the nail on the head. And for anyone looking to stay informed about all things Faroes, this quick roundup offers a valuable glimpse into the heart of the islands.
You're right. It's so easy to get caught up in the big global headlines, but I find these hyperlocal narratives incredibly insightful. They provide a ground-level perspective that you often don't get from international media outlets.
Precisely. And it's important to emphasize that we've presented all of this information in a neutral and objective way, just as it appeared in the Faroe sources. No opinions, no spin, just the facts as we found them.
I appreciate that approach. It empowers the listener to form their own conclusions based on the information presented.
Exactly. It's about encouraging informed engagement and critical thinking, rather than trying to push a particular viewpoint.
Well said. Now, before we conclude this whirlwind tour of today's news from the Faroe Islands, there's one last item I wanted to touch on. Remember the dismissed director at Kringvarp Faroe?
Yes.
The situation with the illegal exemption of the broadcasting fee?
I do.
It seems there was some internal disagreement within the board about the decision to dismiss the director.
Oh.
It wasn't a unanimous vote.
So not everyone agreed that the director's actions warranted dismissal?
Precisely. And I think that highlights something really interesting about Faroe society. There's a clear emphasis on open dialogue and debate, even when tackling difficult or controversial issues.
That's a great observation. It's a reminder that different perspectives and viewpoints exist, even within a close-knit community like the Faroe Islands, and that those diverse voices should be heard.
I couldn't agree more. It's a valuable lesson for all of us, recognizing that there are often multiple sides to every story, and embracing those complexities is essential for fostering understanding and progress.
I think that's a great place to leave it for today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the latest news from the Faroe Islands, what story or development stood out to you the most?
It's tough to pick just one. The political landscape is definitely in flux, with the director's dismissal and the debate surrounding the subsistence allowance, and the economic implications of the car market trends are certainly worth pondering.
You're right, there's a lot to unpack. It's like a snapshot of a society in motion, with all its complexities and nuances. And who knows what tomorrow's news will bring.
Exactly. There's always something happening in the Faroe Islands. A story unfolding, a development to follow.
Well, we've done our best to bring you up to speed on today's headlines. Hopefully you're feeling a bit more in the loop about what's happening in the Faroe Islands. And with all this activity, what story or development piqued your curiosity the most?
That's a great question to reflect on. And perhaps it will inspire you to do your own deep dive into the ever-fascinating world of the Faroe Islands.
Until next time, stay curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is amazing, isn't it? And I think it's so easy to get caught up in, the big global stories that are happening. But I always find these really hyper-local narratives. It's just incredibly insightful they offer, like this ground level perspective that you just don't get from international media outlets usually.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And it's also important to remember that we're presenting all this information just as it appears in the Faroes news. No opinions, no spin, just the facts as we found them.
Right. I mean, and that's what I really appreciate about this approach. It gives the listener the power to draw their own conclusions based on, the actual information.
Absolutely. It's about, fostering that informed engagement and critical thinking rather than, dictating a certain viewpoint.
Yeah, well said. Now, before we wrap up this whirlwind tour of today's news from the Faroe Islands, there's one last thing I wanted to touch on. We were talking about the dismissed director at Faroe earlier.
Right.
The situation with the broadcasting fee.
Yeah.
It turns out there was some disagreement within the board about the decision to actually dismiss the director.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It wasn't actually a unanimous vote.
So some board members didn't think his actions were serious enough to warrant, dismissal.
Exactly. And I think that, brings up something really interesting about Faroe society in general. There's this real emphasis on open dialogue and debate, even when they're addressing difficult or controversial topics.
I see what you mean. Yeah, it reminds us that, even in close-knit communities like the Faroe Islands, you're going to have diverse perspectives. And it's so important that those voices are heard.
Absolutely. And, that's a valuable lesson for all of us, no matter where we live, recognizing that there are, almost always multiple sides to every story. And really embracing those complexities, I think, is crucial for building understanding and making progress.
I couldn't agree more.
So as we come to the end of our deep dive into the latest news from the Faroe Islands, what story or development kind of stands out to you the most?
Oh, that's a tough one. There's so much going on. The political landscape is definitely shifting with the director's dismissal and, all the debate around the subsistence allowance. And then you have the economic implications of those car market trends. Those are worth considering too.
It really is fascinating to see it all come together, isn't it? It's like a snapshot of a society in motion with all its, complexities and nuances. Who knows what tomorrow will bring?
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? There's always something new happening in the Faroe Islands, a story unfolding, a development to keep an eye on.
Well, we've done our best to bring you up to speed on at least today's headlines. Hopefully you're feeling a little more in the loop now about what's going on in the Faroe Islands. With all this activity, what story or development are you most curious to learn more about?
That's a great question to consider. Perhaps it'll even spark your own deep dive into the world of the Faroe Islands.
Until next time, then stay curious.